Cabinet's still in your property. I mean, it's
where the cabinet is too.
Right, exactly. And like I said, some people will deliberately move it into another part of the house, but it technically doesn't matter as long as it's clearly marked as not yours, which is what the tape and other symbols would do for you. All right, enough of that conversation. The camera's rolling. Sorry for being a little bit late, but we were sort of getting caught up on things after the sabbatical break. But now it's time to get back to work. Time to get back to our Mishnah, not just our roving discussion. So by my records, when we finished with Mishnah 4, chapter 4, Mishnah 5. And that means that we are picking up with chapter 4, Mishnah 6, which is of a very similar nature to Mishnah 5, which is, as you may remember, it's been a month, we were talking about when someone buys and sells property, what's included in the sale by default, and what has to be spelled out if you want to make sure. So 4-6, if you don't mind.
Yes. If a man sold a bathhouse, he has not sold the planks or the benches or the curtains, but if he said it and all that is in it, all these are sold also. In neither case has he sold the water containers or the stores of wood.
Okay, so people here seen what ancient bathhouses used to look like? No, you never went to Masada?
I did, but I don't remember.
The bath is like one of the most amazing parts of the reconstruction. Okay, so back in the days of the Mishnah, what you usually had was you had an area with like a hollow floor where they would have the hot air coming through, and that would make heat. Or if you had a bath, like with actual water, that would heat the water around it. But you had this sort of hollowish kind of floor. And oftentimes, there would be wood planks for the floor. And of course, benches to sit in. Because bathhouses were not just places where you like went in the water, came out, and left. Right? You would go, you would schwitz and sweat, and then you'd go in the water, and you'd come out, and you'd scrape your body to get rid of the muck. It was a whole experience, a spa day. Right? That was it was a thing. So the question is, what counts as part of the bathhouse? And the answer is the benches? Nope. The planks? Nope. The other stuff does. Right? Because those are basically just the movable property. You can pull them up, and it's not actually an intrinsic part of the house. Again, we've been talking about how this can be debated, and in different times, in different places. This can vary based upon local custom of what is and isn't expected by the norm of the local area. But for the time of the Mishnah, this was their understanding. However, if you say I'm selling the bathhouse and everything in it, then everything goes along with the sale. Make sense? But in neither case, the water containers, meaning like, buckets and barrels of water and things like that, and the wood that's ready to go to be burnt to make the heat, that is never considered to be part of the bathhouse. Right? Even if you say I'm selling the bathhouse and everything in it, the buckets and the water containers and the wood does not get included. If you say I'm selling the bathhouse, everything in it, and the water containers and the wood, now we're okay. But you'd have to specify them explicitly, whereas the planks and the bench, that would be included if you said everything in it.
How did they come to this conclusion? Is it by what was the norm of, what an average person believe a bathhouse meant?
So yes, it's kind of a mix between what is considered to be movable property and what is considered to have value in and of itself, as opposed to being intrinsic to the item, and whether or not the item has some use without the movable property. So there's sort of a compromise in these different things, but much of that compromise is based upon what is the average person's understanding, right? Of what is being sold and what is being bought, of what is needed, what isn't needed, what is movable, what is intrinsic. That is sort of dealt with, which is why we get so many cases. Because in many different cases, different people might disagree. And so the rabbis were trying to lay down a base marker of and a pattern of what would and wouldn't be included, which can then be adjusted based upon how bathhouses are built today. So for example, nowadays, if you were to go to a spa and say, I want to buy your spa, you probably wouldn't have to specify everything in it in order to get the floor planks. You might still need to specify it for the benches. Depends on whether or not the furniture usually comes with a spa. I don't know. Haven't been to a spa, but you need to maybe double check. But you're probably more likely to find the flooring as part of the property rather than a optional extra. but that would depend upon what the current real estate is.
So would it be more based on whether or not it's movable, or more based on what an average person would understand that to mean?
Yes,
All right, Bob.
you're gonna find a compromise between the two of them, and also whether it has worth in and of itself. Whether it's actually usable in some other capacity, or so therefore it would have its own value rather than just value as part of property. All right, 4.7. Same idea, much bigger scale, or not, depending upon how big you think towns get.
If a man sold the town, he has also sold the houses, cisterns, trenches, caves, bathhouses, dovecotes, olive presses, and irrigated fields, but not movable property.
All right, so I own a town. It's not unreasonable. Right? Towns were not like 50,000 people. The town could have 20 houses. It could have 10 houses. It's just a little speck, speck on a map. And I sell the town. Well, when I sell the town, that doesn't mean I sold all the furniture in all those houses. It just means I sold the town by default. Again, you can specify as it's going to go on to say. Continue.
But if he said, if it and all that is in it, even if cattle and slaves were in it, all these are sold.
Okay, so if he said I sell the town and everything in it, then lock, stock, barrel, right, including both animals and humans that are connected to the property, that is all with the property. Right? You're just handing over the keys and everything else is done. You're walking away from all of the property. But again, that needs to be specified as it and everything in it. Make sense? And then one little caveat from Rabbi Shimon ben Gamliel.
Rabban Shimon ben Gamliel says, if a man sold the town, he has also sold the town watchman.
Okay, which was often a slave that was part of the town cadre of workers. And what he's saying is that even if he didn't say, I'm selling the town and everything in it, and only said, I'm selling the town, everybody would also know that it definitely includes the watchman, that every town has a watchman and you can't sell a town without the watchman. He doesn't win this argument, but that was, again, to show you the pattern of thinking of everybody knows the watchman is part of the town, even if the cows aren't. But he ultimately loses that argument. Good? Like I said, there's a pattern here. It's fairly repetitive, but it's giving us enough examples, hopefully, that we can get a feel for it. Let's move out of the town and into the field.
If a man sold a field, he has also sold the stones that are necessary to it, and the canes in a vineyard that are necessary to it, and its unreaped crop, in a partition of reed which covers less than a quarter ka space of ground, and the watchman's hut, if it was fastened down with a mortar, and ungraft carob trees and young sycamore.
Okay, so maybe do a little bit of a drawing here for this as well. Try going with black. So we've got my field, and my field has grapes growing. What are the grapes growing on?
Fence.
Right. They're growing like on a little trestle, a wood structure that has it there. And maybe I've also got some beans growing. Right? Anybody here ever grow beans?
No.
Right. Beans usually grow up sticks. Right. You plant a stick and the bean is like a vine that goes up, and then the little bean pods hang off of it. I should plant something. You're making gardens. Anyway, they are that. So when you're talking about the reed canes, and when you're talking about the other parts of the thing, you're saying, when I buy your beans, you don't get to take out the stick that the beans are growing on and leave. When I buy your field of beans, I get the sticks too. Right? That is included, because otherwise the beans aren't going to grow. When I buy the grapes from the vineyard, there's the trestle that they're growing on is mine. You don't get to like take the wood away and let the grapes just hit the ground. Right? And so too, if there is a stone wall that's part of the field and necessary to the field, not just some, random thing, that comes with the field when you purchase it. Those parts should make pretty good sense, right? Okay. But The watchman's hut is where we're going to get a difference in this one and others, is a little different. So, you make a little hut and you make it, out of sticks and out of these reeds and all of that. The question is that hut part of the field or not part of the field? Right? This is basically a sukkah. And a sukkah is by definition usually a temporary building. So how do we know whether this is part of the field or not part of the field? What does the Mishnah tell us?
Whether or not it's connected to the ground.
Exactly. If it is bolted down or mortared down or plastered down, there's a couple different ways of reading this. If it is somehow affixed or made to a permanent structure, then it is part of the field. In some of the different interpretations of this, they actually talk about it being like coated in plaster, so that it's not just a little sukkah; it's actually been like sealed as a proper, semi-permanent. It's still shvach. You wouldn't want to live there, but it's more than it would have been if it was just a bunch of sticks standing up. So how permanent of a structure is the question? The same thing here for ungrafted carob trees and for young sycamores. Right? They are not actually important by themselves. Right? They haven't reached their maturity or their utility level, and therefore they're just considered to be part of the ground. They don't have any intrinsic value that might make you reserve them when you were selling the land to the other person. Does that make some sense? Maybe? Okay. Then let's go ahead and move on to 4-9.
4-9.
You get the long one.
Yeah. But one who has sold the field has not sold the stones that are not necessary to it, or the canes in the vineyard that are not necessary to it, or the produce that is already picked from the ground.
All right, let's make sure we get those examples, right? So let's imagine I've got my vineyard and I've already put up extra canes, extra sticks for the vine to grow onto, but it's not growing there yet. All right, so there's another 10 feet worth of wood that's there, but no vines are touching it. When I sell the field, I can cut that and take it with me, right? Because that's not actually part of the field. It's just sitting there. And the same thing with other things like stones that aren't actually, put up to make a wall. If the stones are just scattered and not useful for the field, I can take those stones when I sell the field. They're not part of the field. They're not part of the field's structure. They're not part of the fabric of that working field. So therefore, you don't get them. And if you come back and say, hey, what happened to the extra wood? I can say, I didn't sell you that. And the court would back me up. Make sense?
Yeah.
But
in neither case has he sold any partition of reeds.
No. But if it said.
Okay. But if he had said, eat and all that is in it, all of these are sold also.
All right, so you can still include everything by saying, I sell everything. However, even if you said that, now we get the next section.
Yeah. But in either case has he sold a partition of reeds that covers a quarter cup space of ground, or the watchman's hut, if it was not fastened down with mortar, or grafted carob trees, or cropped sycamores, or any cistern, or wine press, or dovecote, whether they are lying waste or in use.
Okay, so let's start with the easy stuff first, which is if you have a special partition you've got laid out, that's not actually part of the field. And it's even if you say everything in it, no one would think you would include that as part of the field. That's definitely something you want to keep for yourself. Same thing if you have this watchman's hut that isn't attached or made in any permanent way, you're going to move that and take it to another field or sell it to someone else. It's not part of the field itself. That's why it's not locked down. Similarly, things like the carob tree and the crop sycamores, ones that have actually begun to groom and grow, that are beginning to give benefit, or the cistern, for the water, the wine press or the dovecote, those are things that are separate from the field. They are trees, they are produce trees, they are other utility devices. And even though they are in the space of the field, I wouldn't be selling those without specifically enumerating them as additional things being sold. Make sense? Okay, now, I don't know if you remember back when we began chapter 4, there was a bit of a question that's going to come up again. Same answer, by the way. So if you remember beginning of chapter 4, you're good now. It was a month ago. It's okay if you don't. What is the obvious question of if I sell the field and everything in it, but I don't sell the sycamore tree? What's the weird issue that's going to come up to me who was the seller, but now who still owns this tree?
Can't access it.
How do I get to it? Right? I sold you the field. How do I get to my tree? Right? If I didn't, exactly, I'm going to hover.
Yeah.
Okay, so this is where we get a debate about perception, about what do people think they're doing when they sell. And that's what we're going to get in the next section. So if you can carry on reading from, and the seller must.
Yeah, and the seller must purchase from the buyer and wait thereto.
Right, you have to purchase right of way.
Right away. Yeah.
So if I were to sell you the field and keep the tree, as we learned in the first part of the Mishnah, then I have to say when I'm selling you the field, and by the way, I'll give you $1 a month, or I'll give you $5 now, or whatever the deal will be, so that I have the right to go to my tree and come home.
When stuff falls from the tree, does it belong to the owner of the field or the owner of the tree?
It depends on the deals that you've made. But technically, in most circumstances, it belongs to the person upon whose ground it falls. So classic example that still is very relevant in the modern world is if someone has a fruit tree in their backyard and part of the fruit tree goes over into my yard and their oranges fall onto my property, those are my oranges.
Or whether on the tree they're the other guys?
Not exactly, because I have the right to trim it if it comes over onto my property, as long as it's not going to kill the tree.
Right, but you don't have the right to take the fruit then.
If it's on my property, it's part of the trimming process. Technically, I do.
Oh.
But as always, it's best to talk to your neighbor before you start doing these things.
Yeah.
But definitely, once it falls off the tree and comes onto my property, I don't have to pick it up and put it back over, unless I don't like oranges. But I love oranges. Okay, so in this thing, we need to, the sages say, right, the majority say that you would have to purchase, make a deal, some make an arrangement for your ingress and egress into the land to get to your tree when you're making the sale to the new purchaser. Good. But Rabbi Akiva, sorry, that was Rabbi Akiva's opinion.
Yeah.
But the sages have a different opinion.
But the sages say he need not. And Rabbi Akiva agrees that if he had said accepting these, he need not buy himself a way thereto. If he had told them the cistern, winepress, or dovecote to another rabbi,
Meaning to a third person.
yeah,
Right? I'm selling the field to one guy and I'm selling the wine press to another guy.
Rabbi Akiva says he that bought them need not buy himself a way thereto, but the sages say he must buy himself a way thereto.
Okay. So unusually, the Mishnah is going to go and try and explain the thinking of this, right? Of how this, the thought process behind this. So if you could read the next sentence before I try to explain some of what we've got.
When is this so? With regards to he that sells
His field.
sells his field, but if he gives it as a gift, he gives everything that is in it.
All right. So this is hinting at the underlying logic, which is there's a difference between a sale and a gift in how a person feels when they are transferring the property. Right? When I give a gift, there are certain rules that I might have in my mind about what I think I'm doing. I'm being generous, I'm being giving, I'm trying to give everything possible. And when I'm selling, well, most people in business are looking to win when they are selling. And therefore, I will give the absolute minimum that I need to give in order to be lawful in the transaction. Does that logic make sense? Right? If I'm giving somebody a present, I'm not going to say, "Oh, can I have the wrapping paper back?" Right? It's when I give you the present, I'm giving you everything, right? But if I am selling you something and I bring it to you in a nice bag and I'm selling you this thing, it wouldn't be unusual for me to say, oh, can I have the bag back? Because I was only selling you the ball. I wasn't selling you the bag and the ball. And a gift, I probably wouldn't ask for back. In a purchase, I at least might ask for back. So if we go back and with that in mind and we run it through the Rabbi Akiva and the sages, then we can see that each of them has a different opinion about how a person does business. Rabbi Akiva assumes that when I am selling my stuff, I'm selling everything, right? That I am being as maximal in my sale as possible. Whereas the sages believe that when I am selling my stuff, I am being minimal in what I am selling. So Rabbi Akiva says, because I am selling everything to the maximum interpretation, I need to buy back a way to get to my tree. But because the sages think that I am selling in a minimal sense, when I sell it, I would clearly be reserving something for myself, and therefore I don't need to buy a way to get to and from my tree. So it's about how they each believe the human logic, the human intention is when it comes to this buying and selling. Does that make sense?
Sure.
Okay. Now, it does happen that in this case, Rabbi Akiva wins in the long term in Jewish law. So technically, when you sell it, you're selling the maximal definition. And you would.
His way make more sense.
Well, so that this is why you need an actual ruling, because both of them make sense, right? I mean, I'm not going to sell you a field and keep a tree, but not keep a way to get to my tree.
Yeah.
But on the other hand, long term, I happen to agree with Rabbi Akiva that whether or not he is characterizing human nature in the most correct manner, his way will cause the least trouble, right? Because if people know that when I sell a field, I'm selling a field, all of it, and if I keep the tree, I still have to work out an arrangement for the field.
Well,
If I know that in advance, I will make an arrangement for getting to my tree. Whereas if I don't, and I just say, oh, he knows that I'm going to still want to come and get to my tree, that's where things begin to happen. As we talked about last time, again, it was a month ago, I know, but you can go back and review the recording if you like. The more you say, the easier it is to avoid conflict.
You see, I think Rabbi Akiva is the right way because the watchman thing,
right?
If it's connected solidly to the ground, is part of the field, but the tree not.
But but the tree is not part of. But the tree is not part of the field because it has its own separate identity and utility. And by the way, if that's bothering you, wait until we get to chapter 5, where we talk about buying trees without the ground. Right, so it is absolutely possible to buy a tree and not buy the ground the tree stands on.
Yeah.
Exactly, literally the ground underneath, which is going to create
makes
some
sense if you buy the tree and you plan to dig it out and take it someplace else. But are they selling it standing in the same field?
Why not?
Complicated.
Legal issues today.
Yeah. Legal issues here.
And there's no legal issues in the society. I mean, so
I like simple stuff,
and that's fine. And that's fine.
Yeah.
Don't go into business back 2,000 years ago.
Buying trees.
Right. It's nothing. No one says you have to buy a tree.
Yeah.
But the question is, if someone wants to buy a tree, right? Maybe somebody wants to buy the tree because they want the produce coming from the tree, but they don't care about the rest of the field and they couldn't afford the rest of the field. Well, can't we work out what the law should be, right? Can't we figure out who would have the right to do what and all? Well, yeah, we can kind of work that out.
Don't they call it, I noticed they don't use the word tree, they use the word sycamore tree.
Yes.
So that would be because a sycamore tree probably yields a lot of fruit, therefore it has its own value or not?
It's specifically talking about these trees because they are useful representations of what a tree might be, but it could be any other type of tree as well, right? As long as the tree has its own value, right? So if I have to be on guard because I haven't reviewed this recently, because I reviewed this before the sabbatical, but other types of tree that are just for shade or of decorative value would not necessarily have the same application. But a tree that is actually worth something,
like apples and orange trees would be the equivalent.
right, would follow the same kind of rule.
Olive trees would be around there too.
Yeah, and now again, you can sell it as an orchard, and that's perfectly fine. The other thing, of course, is that carob and sycamore trees would often be solitary trees. You didn't necessarily have to have a orchard of them, whereas olive trees and orange trees and other types of fruit trees, you would usually have more than one in a field.
All right, so the olives and orchard wouldn't be implied then, huh?
Well, like I said, it wouldn't be common to have just a single olive tree.
Right. So like,
But a single carob tree was not unusual.
So if you had a bunch of carob trees, though, then would that change anything if there was a bunch of them?
Well, let me put it this way. If you had a field where there was a bunch of carob trees on one side and a bunch of other produce on the other, then you don't actually have a field, you have a field and an orchard. And then you would need to specify, wait a minute, are we talking about this property or are we talking about the dirt? And if we're talking about the dirt, then the things that are immediately connected to the dirt, right, borei pariha adama, that is going to be connected, and that is something that will be sold. And the things that are from the eights, from the tree, would not be. But if we're talking about, space, then we would need to make it very clear which space we're talking about: the orchard side, the field side, or all of it.
Right. I thought this was when you don't make it clear, though.
Well, that's part of the issue. But the reasonable assumption would be, and as we're going to see, that if you're buying an orchard, then you are buying the ground that is around it. And an orchard is defined by 3 or more trees.
All right. So there's 3 more trees on a field. They'd be assuming you're buying the trees too.
Yes, because then you're buying the dirt of the orchard. Okay, but we're not done yet with 9. Because I know we got for the gift and we got for the sale, but what happens when it comes to dividing an inheritance?
Yeah, if brothers who divided and in turn inheritance came into possession of a field, they come on to possession of everything that is in it. If a man secures...
Right, so then they would divide based on everything in it, right? So if you inherit your father's field, you inherit your uncle's field, you inherit it and all of the property in it, and that means you need to divide the value between the brothers as is appropriate for the inheritance. Onward.
If a man secure title by possession of the property of a convert and secure title by possession of the convert's field, he secures title to everything that is in it. All
right, this is a little bit more complicated because the rules of how converts left inheritance is a little different than others. So as I just mentioned, if we're talking about like a regular person inheriting, they're going to inherit from their father. They'll inherit from their uncle. They'll inherit from someone in the family. Because if anyone dies, there is a family tree that you can follow to find some relative, even if it's like a 5th cousin or something. Right? There is going to be a way to find a living relative. If somebody converted to Judaism and they haven't gotten married, they have no children, they are literally isolated from everyone else in the world when it comes to inheritance, because their parents don't inherit, because when they converted, they are cut from their parents, right? Their parents are now Abraham and Sarah. And that was, of course, in the ancient world, very important, because in the ancient world, their parents were idolaters, and usually it wasn't such a great situation, right? The idolaters they didn't get along well with the Jewish people in the ancient world. So a convert really was on their own in the Jewish world. And if they had no heirs, they had no children of their own, remember, it's very important. When they died, their property was up for grabs.
What do you mean grabs?
Anybody who gets it, you get it first, it's yours. Right?
Like
so
Wild West.
Without the fighting, right? Without the fighting. But if your neighbor was a convert and he dies in the night, you can say, all of this is mine.
Wow.
Right? I've got all this property now. And the question that's here is, well, wait, when you say you've got his field, does that mean you get his field or his field plus everything in it? And the answer is, I get all of it. Right? So it's not like I claim the field and someone else says, okay, well, I'm taking the plow. Like, no, when I said I take the field, I get all of it. And it is literally first come, first serve. Again, this is only in the situation where somebody who converted has no heirs of their own. If they've got children, their children get their stuff.
In a sense, it makes some sense. Because let's say you have a convert, and his neighbor knows he's a convert, and as soon as that convert dies, he takes the field. It makes sense a little bit, because
Yeah, but someone else could as well. It doesn't
Yeah.
have to be your neighbor. It could be,
No, no, it has to be, yeah.
Bob from down the road.
But most likely, he's the only one. The neighbor is the only one
Yeah.
who knows.
Most likely it'll stay in the community.
Yeah.
Yes. And that was important, right? Because if you were not doing it this way, then the problem would become, of course, that the in-laws, the non-Jewish family, which were, remember, in this ancient world, they were idolaters, they were antithetical and often very antagonistic to the Jewish people. They'd become your new neighbors,
Yeah.
right? And that would become problematic. So when somebody converted, it really means they are cut off from their previous family because of how horrible things were in the ancient world.
How come it didn't go to like Tzedakah, to the Sanhedrin or something?
Because they didn't have a claim on it that was greater than anyone else.
Right, but they could have been used for the community instead of just a specific person.
But it could have, yes. But that doesn't mean that legally it must.
Right.
Right? The law is only telling us that it is now ownerless, literally ownerless.
Yeah.
Right? Hefker, exactly.
Yeah.
So because it's ownerless, whoever comes across it gets it first. It's just like, the $100 bill sitting in the middle of the street, and not the one you saw fall out of someone's pocket, the one you just see in the middle of nowhere. You can pick it up and you can give it to tzedakah if you want, but you don't have to, right? You're not obligated to. It's now hefker. It's ownerless because it is a non-discriminate, indiscriminate. What's the right term for that? It's something with no identifying or discernible features. So it can't be returned to the rightful owner, and therefore the rightful owner has despaired of finding it, and it is now ownerless, and therefore it is the first person who finds it now owns it. The same thing in this particular case. So yes, a person who takes it could say, I'm taking this, and now I'm going to liquidate the assets and I'm going to give it to charity.
Yeah.
Sure. But
I was surprised it's the temple. Well, this was after the temple.
so,
Sanhedrin didn't.
well, no, but they still are, as we're going to see, they are going to talk about dedicating things for the temple. But
You have to dedicate in your will.
I know that we have a perception of institutions as always trying to take as much as they can, right? That the Catholic Church, during the Middle Ages was very interested in growing their domain. And certainly, many politicians and the ancient world kings and lords always wanted to take more and more and more. Judaism doesn't give that authority to the Sanhedrin or to the temple or to anyone. You have a right to take what you have a right to take. And just because you are the Sanhedrin doesn't mean you have the right to take somebody's property more than the person who lived next door to him. You may have more authority on halakha, but that doesn't give you more authority in business. You're still just a regular person. So if Rabbi Akiva shows up 5 minutes late and someone else has taken the convert's property, Rabbi Akiva can't say, but I'm Rabbi Akiva. No, sorry.
Right.
You don't have any standing in this sphere. I think I mentioned before, one of my favorite political philosophers of Rawls talking about, or was it Walzer? I can't remember. No, Rawls was Veil of Ignore. Walzer was spheres of justice, with the idea that just because you have power in one sphere doesn't mean you have power in another. Just because you are powerful in the Sanhedrin doesn't mean you have power in business. In business, you're treated just like the rest of us. And that's a very important Jewish principle. The state does not have the right to take something just because it's the state. It only has the right to take something if Jewish law says it has the right to take. And you don't have the right here. So, yeah, it's both a very expansive definition, because we do give the state and the community lots of power that might seem a little surprising in the modern world, but we also limit the power of the community and the state in many ways that might seem surprising in the modern world.
Yeah.
It doesn't fit neatly into American political philosophies.
Plus, logically, it seems like if your parents were considered to be Abraham and Sarah,
Mm-hmm.
it seems like your inheritors would be the children of Abraham and Sarah.
They are. That's your neighbor.
Yeah.
One. That's one.
Yeah. When I die and it goes to my 10th cousin, that's still just one person. I mean, an inheritance is always being divided by the inheritors. In this, it's just trying to prevent, us trying to say, all right, so we're going to divide this guy's house by the 15 million Jews there are in the world. Okay, so you get this piece of wood and you get that piece. It's just, no, it's free. It's open, and take it. So it makes sense in the unique circumstance of the ancient world. I should point out, in the modern world, converts are considered to have the right to dispose of their property as they wish. They leave it to whoever they want. They want to leave it to their non-Jewish family. the community does not object. Okay, a little bit more.
If a man dedicated a field to the temple, he has dedicated everything in it.
Okay, so if I say I'm dedicating my field to the temple, which would be making it holy, it's hekdesh now, right? It's you are sanctifying the field, and that is more than just saying the value of the field. It also means that temporarily, at least until it gets redeemed or whatever else happens with it, you can't use what's in that field, right? All of that field becomes off limit because it's now property of the temple. Make sense? Well, when you do that, according to the sages, all of it, the plow, everything else in it, that all becomes dedicated to the temple.
Even the slaves?
If they are attached to the field, right? So yes, if you were to own a town, they would go in the same bucket of things that are set aside. But there would be a redemption based off the value and so on. It would be worked out. Better to simply detach these things before you make the proclamation. But that is where you would be putting your foot in it. Onward.
Rabbi Shimon says if a man dedicated the field, he has dedicated only the grafted carob trees and cropped sycamore.
Right, so he's actually got a different idea. He says, look, when you dedicate a field, the movable random bits of it aren't actually part of it. But what I will tell you is that these trees that earlier we said in the sale were not included, right? The carob tree and the grafted carob tree and the crop sycamore, those, because they are connected to the land, those do get included. Now he loses his argument, but it's an interesting way of trying to look at it, which is to say, because they get their life from the land, and it's part of the land, at least with regards to dedicating all that comes from the land, which is a vow for the temple. But like I said, he loses the argument because still they are separate, and it follows the same rule as it would for a sale.
If there's three, they get it.
If there's three and you're saying a specific area rather than saying field, remember field is kind of like a technical term. That means that's different than a sedeh is different than a pardes. A field is for a certain type of agriculture, and an orchard is for a different type of agriculture. So yes, you can sort of identify that it's an orchard because of the number of trees, but you would probably use a different word to describe it if you were being a normal person. Normal farmer 2,000 years ago. Most people nowadays, we can't tell the difference between a field and a field. Right? Think of a field as a place where you throw around a football, not as a place where you actually grow food. But that would be there was terminology that would be more likely to be used. But in the modern world, yes, we would still need to worry about that because we're not as precise in our terms for agricultural spaces. Make sense? Okay. And I think we're going to leave it there since we are a little low on attendance today. We just finished chapter 4. I don't really want to start chapter 5 without more of our attendees. As you will see, it actually is similar about the purchase, but it's going to introduce some more concepts about how we know what people are thinking. And I want to make sure we've got everyone together before we push on. So any final questions about chapter 4 before we move on? Because like I said, some of the themes are going to be very similar. So if you're confused on 4, you're going to still be confused in 5. We're pretty good? Okay. Look at that. We got 3 people watching at home. Need to get them in the room.